Good day, Ottawa History people, and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. My name is Brendan Ray, and I'm excited to talk to you today about the first European to visit Ottawa, Monsieur Etienne Brule. He was more than just the first tourist to pass by, but he was the epitome of the French explorer, often imitated and never duplicated. These next 3 episodes are going to lead into the Beaver War, or the French-Iroquois War, of the 16 and early 1700s. In the last episode, we met the Algonquins, and over the next 3 episodes, we'll be meeting the French so that we'll have more of a background to understand the context of the Beaver Wars, which defined the situation for much of the 17th century. Etienne Brule was a French explorer and interpreter who played a pivotal role in the early exploration of what is now Canada, particularly the province of Ontario. To the best records available, he was the first European to pass through what is now Ottawa in 1610. He was the first French explorer to pass beyond the Saint Laurence and Richelieu basins. New France was a gradual development and not an instant paradigm-changing reality in the New World. Jacques Cartier was the first Frenchman to explore the North American coastline. One of the important things to remember about Jacques Cartier is that he was not, and I repeat not, Hernán Cortés. His name has not been dragged through the mud and the blood of history to emerge a villain. He made 2 trips to the Gulf of the St. Lawrence and up the river in 1535, and then again 6 years later in 1541. Quebec City was founded as a permanent trading post 67 years later in 1608. That's 51 years after Cartier's death, establishing the colony of Nouvelle-France, and Montreal, the last of the deep-water ports, wouldn't be founded until 1642, 101 years after Cartier's last voyage. New France was a slow build, and it was done in stages. The Canadian hinterland was something that would have been heard of since the days of Etienne Brule's grandparents. But it had, in the imaginations of the French, remained an imposing dark forest of trees, snow, and hostile inhabitants, and would remain that way for a long time. It kinda still is. Into this steps Brule, a young man who left no personal record, only mention in the works of others, particularly the Lieutenant General of New France, Samuel de Champlain, Gabriel Sagard, and the Jesuit missionary Jean de Brébeuf. It's from their work and a few other surviving records that the life of Etienne Brule can be reconstructed. Etienne Brule was born circa 1592. Those of you who love exact dates and confirmed historical records will find this life a little frustrating. My apologies in advance. He was not a nobleman or the child of rich parents, so because of this the records are sparse. He was born in Champigny-sur-Marne, just west of Paris. In 1608, at age 16, he boarded Samuel de Champlain's ship, the Don de Dieu, the Gift of God, and set sail for New France, among the first mission to create a permanent settlement in what would become Quebec City. While the name Nouvelle-France was used, and this was officially a colony of France, there are 3 important things to keep in mind throughout this story. The first is that there were only a few hundred people who spoke French in all of North America. Nouvelle-France was not French in 1610. Oh, the French crown certainly claimed the land, but there was no reality of control on the ground. It was French only insofar that the English, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese were not allowed to go and settle there because of treaties. The second important consideration is that Quebec City was founded as far inland as tall, ocean-going ships could safely go. The island of Montreal was home to a large Montagnais Innu settlement at the time of Cartier, but it had been dispersed for unknown reasons, and the island of Montreal was now a summer trading post for Odawa, Algonquin, and Saint Laurence Iroquois. It was not in the French interest to try to displace or conquer it at this point, although that time will come, so the city of Montreal wouldn't be founded for another 30 years. Quebec was the western periphery of the French power in the Americas, not a central part of any colony. French colonial settlement was underway in Acadia, Ile Saint-Jean, and Ile Royale, the future New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Cape Breton. But the stretch into the inland of the river of the Saint Lawrence was a more precarious affair. In the last episode, we discussed how the Algonquin were the eastern periphery of the Anishinaabe. Well, Quebec City would be the western periphery of the French. This created a no-man's land between these people, and an opportune meeting place for both. The third thing to consider is that Quebec was founded with a royal charter, but it was only marginally a state enterprise. Quebec City would become a famous fortress, but it was founded largely as a trading post, with the local notables being merchants engaged in fur trading from inland and whaling from the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. The affairs of state were of only marginal interest so far away from the metropole. It was not just France that was setting up communities on the St. Lawrence. Into this settlement came a small colony of traders from the interior, looking to set up a trading post of their own. They were a small mix of Anishinaabe from the Odawa and Algonquin communities, and Wendat Huron from the interior of the Great Lakes region. Just to throw some confusing names at you, the Wendat are an Algonquin-speaking people, and to the south, the Haudenosaunee were also an Iroquois-speaking people, often referred to simply as the Iroquois, or the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Five Nations. I'll be calling them Haudenosaunee rather than Iroquois, so as to cut down on this confusion. The Richelieu River that flows from Lake Champlain in the territory of the Haudenosaunee was called La Rivière des Iroquois at this point. In 1609, an Algonquin chief named Iroquet arrived at Quebec to make a treaty with the French and establish a small Algonquin trading colony next to the small French trading colony. If this was a novel, the editor would be yelling at the writer, telling him or her to change some of these names because it would confuse the reader. This is one of those times where I wish that a messy history was more like a well-structured piece of fiction. It was in this small Indigenous community just north of Quebec that young Etienne Brule began to make friends and learn the language. His proficiency with his native French and the Anishinaabe-Moan of the Algonquin and the Odawa, as well as Wyandot, the Iroquoian language spoken by the Wendat, would be integral to his career as a dragoman, an explorer, and a trader. He would become the archetypal runner of the woods, or coureur de bois. There are two terms that are often used interchangeably, but are slightly different. A voyager is a fur trader, or trapper, who is an agent of a company, or who is licensed by the government of France. A coureur de bois was an independent, or a part of a small company that would then trade their wares to a fur merchant for export to Europe. The line between these two designations was porous, and on this part of the world stage, a man could play many parts. In 1610, because of Brule's emerging competence with Indigenous languages, Champlain made an agreement with the Algonquin leader Iroquet for a community exchange where an Algonquin, given the name Sauvignon, was sent back to France along with Champlain to learn the ways of the French and report back within a year. And a young Frenchman, in turn, was sent to live with the Algonquin for a year. The by now 18-year-old Etienne Brule was tested by 2 winters in the colony, including the brutal first winter, when Brule was one of 9 surviving colonists, and his cultural experience and knowledge made him an excellent candidate for this opportunity. His opposite member, Sauvignon, went to France with Champlain and returned in 1611. Like Brule, he didn't leave a record, except in the words of others, little of which survives to this day. Champlain reported in his journal that he was glad to return Sauvignon to his people. On 19 June in 1610, Champlain and the French army, with their Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, and Montagnais-Innu allies, defeated a Mohawk force at Sorel-Tracy, which is about halfway between modern Trois-Rivières and Montreal, securing the Saint Lawrence up to the island of Montreal, after which Brule and his adopted family of Algonquins continued along to Sault Ste. Louis, modern-day Lachine Rapids, where Brule's eyes had gone further upriver than any Europeans before. At the western end of the island of Montreal, the Algonquin took the right fork up the Ottawa River instead of the left fork leading further down the St. Lawrence. This was a logical decision at the time. The St. Lawrence was an open conflict zone between the English and Dutch-backed Haudenosaunee and the French-allied Algonquin. The Ottawa Valley was populated by friendly communities of Anishinaabe-Moan-speaking Algonquin, Kitchissippirini, and Nipissing. There was also a large number of nearby Montagnais or Innu people. In addition to the Odawa traders that would frequent the route from Georgian Bay, up French River, to Lake Nipissing, then portage over to the Ottawa at Mattawa, then head down to the St. Lawrence. This route went through a heavily populated and very friendly territory where they could easily reprovision and collect more trading goods on their way down to Quebec and distribute European trading goods on the way back home. 1 year less a week later, on 13 June 1611, Brule canoed down the Ottawa with his adoptive clan and returned to Quebec, where Champlain was shocked to find that the young man he'd seen a year prior was wearing the clothes of the Algonquin, speaking their language comfortably, and seemingly to have flourished from his experiences up the Ottawa. For the next 4 years, Brule acted as a translator for fur merchants and taught Anishinaabe-Moan to aspiring missionaries, as well as occasional treks up the Ottawa with his Algonquin friends and family. There is no concrete record of Brule again until 1615, when Samuel de Champlain found himself in La Mer Douce, the freshwater sea by which he meant Lake Huron, and there found a Wendat group and their translator, Etienne Brule. Brule shared his maps with Champlain, covering Lake Huron up to the entrance of Lake Superior at modern-day Sault Ste. Marie. Champlain was planning an attack on the Onondaga, one of the 5 Haudenosaunee component nations in today's northern New York State, with his French regulars and Wendat allies. He asked Brule to accompany a handful of Wendat through the Haudenosaunee territory to Carantuan, the seat of the Susquehannock, near modern-day Tioga, New York, and help to rally these allies of the Wendat against their shared enemy, the Haudenosaunee. The Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Susquehannock were all Iroquoian peoples, speaking Iroquoian languages. It's important to remember that being in the same language group does not automatically imply friendship or alliance. It simply means that they would have ease of communication. They have a similar culture, a similar vocabulary and grammar structure, but that's about it. Brule and the team of Wendat traveled overland to Lake Simcoe, down the Humber River to Lake Ontario, along the western side of Lake Ontario to the Niagara River, past the falls, and then south across Lake Erie, then overland to the Susquehannock, avoiding any Haudenosaunee patrol. The good news is that they were successful in their legation to the Susquehannock. They collected a sizable force and then went to join Champlain in his assault on the Onondaga at modern-day Syracuse, New York. The bad news was that because they had taken such a safe route, by the time that they got there, Champlain and his Wendat allies had got tired of waiting for Brule and his alleged Susquehannock reinforcements and attacked without them. They were defeated soundly, and Brule and his reinforcements arrived 2 days later. Realizing the misfortune that happened to the French and Wendat, Brule and the Susquehannock turned around and returned to Carantuan. From there, Brule continued to explore south through Pennsylvania as far as Chesapeake Bay, before returning to the Wendat lands of the Great Lakes region, staying in the Wendat Bear Clan settlement of Tuanche. Brule was not destined to spend much dedicated time on the Ottawa River, but he maintained good relations with the Algonquin and the Odawa and traveled the river many times. Unfortunately for him, he didn't maintain great relationships with his French brethren. At the age of 18, he went to live among the indigenous inhabitants of North America, and he only returned to French polity upon occasion. usually as a translator, guide, or mercenary. Champlain described him as vicious in character and much addicted to women. As the original and in many ways quintessential coureur de bois, he picked and chose the cultural norms from each community to fashion his own lifestyle. Gabriel Sagard, a Recollect missionary living amongst the Wendat in Huronia, did not have a more positive opinion than Champlain had. While Brule had assisted him with his lexicon of the Huron language, Wyandot, Sagard recalled that Brule could not remember the words to any but the most basic prayers expected of a good Roman Catholic young man. Champlain objected that Brule was a man of ill repute, who worked for the merchants and for himself, and not the glory of France, while Sagard begrudged him for putting those same loyalties above his loyalty to his faith. In 1629, during one of the many French and English wars, Quebec City surrendered without a fight to the English privateers under the Kirke brothers, David, Louis, and Thomas. Despite a negotiated peace agreed upon in Paris and London, which ordered the return of Quebec to the French authorities, the pirates held on to the trading post for 3 years until 1632, when Champlain was able to return as chief administrator. Throughout this dark time, when Quebec was administered by English privateers, Brule enjoyed a positive working relationship with the interregnal administration. Unsurprisingly, this did not endear him to Champlain, who declared him an outlaw. Fortunately, this enmity did not last long. Unfortunately, this was only because Brule had a year left in his mortal coil. Brule lived among the Wendat, particularly the Bear clan, from 1618 until 1633, at which point his neighbors believed that he was trading surreptitiously with some of the Seneca traders from the Haudenosaunee, their recurring enemies. The Bear clan killed Brule, then took up camp and moved elsewhere in Huronia. The missionary Sagard claims that the Bear clan felt that they had been cursed by Brule's last breath, and even went so far as to claim that the Bear clan had eaten their long-term guest. Cannibalism was quite uncommon, but not completely unheard of, amongst Iroquoian people, but attesting to this instance is not possible given the lack of first-hand accounts. Etienne Brule was the first European to set foot in what would become Ottawa, also anywhere in the Ottawa Valley, the Humber Valley, and 4 of the 5 Great Lakes, with apologies to Michigan. He was an interpreter, explorer, adventurer, diplomat, and businessman, and was one of the first of that class that would go on to be called the coureur de bois. He was the first Franco-Ontarian, living and eventually dying at age 41, after having spent half his life in what would become the province. His memory is more in Ontario than Quebec, as he was an adventurer, and hardly a champion of either Catholicism or a nascent Quebecois national identity. Without the institutions of state or religion to champion his name, he doesn't quite make it into the pantheon of Canadian heroes of the age of exploration. He left no written record of his own words, and his life and experiences have to be pieced together from what others have recorded. The largest French-language high school in Toronto is École Secondaire Etienne Brule, which is 20 kilometers away from the Etienne Brule Park. Etienne Brule is a small residential street in Ottawa, and Rue Etienne Brule is a similarly small road in a fairly dodgy part of Gatineau. Etienne Brule Lookout in Gatineau Park is quite lovely, and Etienne Brule Lake is a 2.5-hour drive west of Ottawa. Thanks for listening, everybody. This podcast is written, voiced, and edited by myself, Brendan Ray. In our next episode, we're going to hear about Etienne Brule's contemporary and occasional boss, Samuel de Champlain, and how the French government officials acted in the new colonies, as opposed to the more freewheeling coureur de bois. Please take a moment to give us a 5-star review on whatever podcatcher you use, or preferably write a short review. This helps the algorithm promote the podcast, which is so essential as I start out. I really appreciate that. You can send me an email at ottawahistoryhub@gmail.com and follow me on Facebook at Ottawa History Hub, on X or Twitter at OttHistoryHub, that's OTTHISTORYHUB. Please visit the website at ottawahistoryhub.com. Take care, everybody. Advance Ottawa, en avance!